the morning of June the 3rd, we were instructed to pack and stow everything as we had rehearsed several times, but this time it was for real. The convoy, gradually being augmented by other units, crawled slowly down the English lanes to Gosport. I remember that the people of the villages en route, sensing that something was on, would bring out cups of tea, biscuits, cigarettes, and all they could spare. On arrival in Gosport, we were issued with packed boxes of food, seasickness tablets, and packets of free fags. Next morning, religious services were being conducted by all the various denominations. We of the C of E, or C of S in my case, were given copies of Psalm 91, which I carried in my breast pocket throughout the campaign, and which I still possess. A trifle dog-eared perhaps, but still readable. Later in the evening, we moved further down to the docks. That evening we made our way sometimes an inch or so or two at a time. We crawled onto the piers where the landing barges awaited, their ramp doors open like the jaws of prehistoric monsters. I had a 3-tonner with a half-load of wireless sets and spares, and fully charged batteries, and was instructed to keep close to Captain Heap's jeep, which was about a dozen vehicles ahead. By the time we reached the loading area, we had been infiltrated by vehicles from other sections, and I was guided on board by a military policeman and found my truck crammed between vehicles belonging to a section of Royal Engineers, who were in fact a mine detection and bomb disposal unit. I could see vehicles of my own unit boarding in bits and pieces. They too had been split up more than somewhat. The idea that on landing all units would be in close proximity to each other and would reform on shore. The most sinister acquisition of the day was the allocation of white wooden crosses, one each, which we would keep handy. We left the coast of England about 3 in the afternoon of the 5th of June and joined what was to be known as the greatest armada of all time. The ships and landing craft were stretched around us as far as the eye could see, and RAF fighter aircraft were shooting around overhead. The weather was poor for June, and we learnt later that D-Day had in fact been originally set for the 5th, but had been postponed for 1 day because of the squally conditions. It would have been impossible to postpone for longer because of the enormous problems of coordination and timing. The sea was decidedly choppy, and halfway across many of the lads, including myself, were sick, caused no doubt by the sea but also by fear and apprehension. Late in the evening, the drone of aircraft overhead went on for hours as thousands of planes carrying paratroopers and equipment lumbered towards France. The coast of Normandy was divided into separate zones, each code-named. I'll not enter into details regarding the allocation of the zones between the British, Canadians and Americans, not forgetting of course the Poles, Free French and other Allied forces. I will of course mention that my destination was Sword Beach, where 27th Armoured Brigade would be in support of 3rd British Infantry Division, with which formation I would serve the last 2 years in the Army. About 2/3 of the way across, which was probably the widest part of the channel, we put down anchor along with hundreds of other craft on either side. We were to lie there until the afternoon of next day, the 6th of June. In the meantime, the hours of darkness were filled with the sounds of aircraft, whoops from destroyers, and moans of the weary sick soldiers on board. The noises of war were getting louder. The commandos were in, the paratroops were in, and the Navy were shelling hell out of the areas at the rear of the beaches. The confusion on the beach we were to hear later was unbelievable, and build-ups of men and material had to be halted. The German defence had been pushed back a mile or so, but there was little room for any follow-up infantry and support units. We set off again and arrived at our beachhead about 6 p.m. I drove off the LCV, landing craft vehicle that is, quite easily in only a few inches of water, thinking that my course in Inverary had been a waste of time. The beach was a hive of activity, with marshals shouting, waving and signalling. On the last few hundred yards into the beach, a large number of vehicles were submerged and out of action, and bodies were floating around in fair numbers. I felt sick at heart and scared stiff. I was reunited with my friends, and only self-respect, or perhaps my personal pride, forced me to act as though I felt normal. I would guess that the majority of the others felt exactly the same. The engineers and pioneer corps were laying steel mesh roadways off the beach, and eventually we harboured along the hedgerows of Normandy outside a village called Colville-sur-Orne. Rifle and machine gun fire was going on, not far enough away for my liking, and the Germans replied in the shape of 88mm shells, which were falling at intervals all around. I was sickened to see the white crosses already marking hastily dug graves, with rifles and steel helmets stuck on the top. There were also numerous bodies strewn around, and it was difficult to focus one's eyes without seeing these grim reminders that death was at close quarters. We dug flint trenches. Some of the lads found abandoned German foxholes, but the fact that booby traps had been discovered in some of these made their use very dangerous. During the night, the shelling and bombing continued. Jerry was showering the beach and immediate rear areas with mortar bombs and anti-personnel bombs, while the intermittent whine and explosion of his 88s were terrifying. I slept little, none of us did, although normally our weariness would have prompted sound slumber. I felt so sorry for the assault infantry who were up ahead and unable to close their eyes. Theirs indeed was the ultimate test of a man's endurance, both mental and physical. Being with a corps unit, I could at least carry extra clothes, kit and food. The infantryman could not. He only had what he could carry on his person, and his gun and ammunition were his most important possessions. The tank crews of our own regiments also warranted my sympathy. The news that a fair number of our tanks had been hit came through, and the thought of being trapped in a blazing tank was too horrific to even contemplate. Came the dawn, and most of us crawled out of our foxholes and were surprised to find casualties fairly light after the night's happenings. We breakfasted on corned beef and hard biscuits. We could make tea in special self-heating tins in one of the packs supplied to us. The stores began to come ashore, and we had to draw rations at the store trucks. The boxes of supplies known as compo packs were lettered A, B, C and D. An A pack contained tin bacon, tin steak and kidney pie, and also tins of fruit and cream. The B pack was slightly more inferior, and the C and D packs progressively less attractive, the D pack being mostly composed of bully beef and hard biscuits. We each had a daily ration of 7 boiled sweets and 7 cigarettes. Eventually the fags arrived in tens of 50, and everyone smoked their heads off.